I call on the member for Lyndhurst, but I ask all members of the House to extend the same courtesy that was given to the Treasurer. Member for Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I never thought that I would accuse the Treasurer of being a student of Marx. And while I would never suggest that there are many followers of Karl Marx opposite, there are more than a few that do a pretty good impression of Groucho, who said, politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. Mr. Speaker, this budget would make Groucho proud. And that's on top of the uncanny resemblance to the ever-silent Harpo that has become the Treasurer's stock in trade in the lead-up to budgets. Certainly, the Treasurer is pretty good at looking for trouble. He's now spent 17 months blaming everyone and everything for Victoria's economic woes. If it's not the former government, the federal government, the carbon tax, the GFC, the euro debt crisis, Japan's earthquake, or the high Australian dollar, it's the Reserve Bank that's playing the role of villain in the pantomime that has become Victoria's fiscal strategy. If imitation is flattery, Groucho would be touched to see how the Treasurer has gone about incorrectly diagnosing the state's problems. Victorians are supposed to believe that the Treasurer was right last year when his budget denied there was a jobs crisis and contained no measures to stimulate economic growth and generate jobs. Mr. Speaker, Victorians remember his entire budget speech, and the word jobs was not uttered once. Victorians are now paying the price for that arrogant miscalculation. And as for applying the wrong remedies, Victorians might have been better off with Harpo's whistling and horn blowing than the directionless drivel offered up to Victorians in Tuesday's budget. The sad truth is that this government was told last year that for our state to thrive, we needed a plan to create jobs. But the Baillieu government knew better and instead invested its energy in trying to trash the economic legacy of the former government. Victorian families are now bearing the cost of that choice. We've all heard the now notorious story of the Premier being asked at a boardroom lunch about his vision. He's said to have got out of his chair, walked to the window, looked into the distance and declared, "I can see my house from here."
That's a vision.
The Premier may hate being asked the question, but Victorians don't need stand-up. They need a statesman. Our state needs a vision comparable with the journey that we've been on and commensurate with the challenges we now face. Victoria has led the nation for decades. We've come up with the big ideas for reform of our federation. We've driven the national reform agenda. We've run Australia's best health system. We led the nation for jobs creation. We pioneered to create the world's safest roads. We've staged the best sporting events. We've led culturally and creatively. Our regions thrived even in the face of drought, floods and fire. And Melbourne became the world's most livable city. We've created a thriving and diverse community, the most multicultural in the world. This legacy was not the creation of one government or even one political party. We've had continuity with successive governments building on the strengths of those that came before. Victoria has set the benchmark for the rest of Australia, but setting the benchmark demands an ambitious government, a government that looks forward to make things better rather than one that looks back to find something to blame. Victorians have always had to pedal faster. Not blessed with abundant natural resources, Victorians can never afford to be complacent. But now our vital signs are showing the strain. The government's own budget reveals that economic growth has fallen from a healthy 3% to 1.5% this year. In 2009, in the middle of the global financial crisis, 92% of the full-time jobs created in Australia were generated right here in Victoria. Last year, the Treasurer promised us 55,000 jobs a year. Instead, we're losing 900 every week. And the government's own budget reveals that employment growth is now forecast at 0.00%. Yesterday, with only 2 months to go, the Treasurer wouldn't even guarantee reaching that. Unemployment is now at 5.8%, higher than any state in mainland Australia. While the government tells Victorians that they've got their back on jobs, if you look at the budget, the government actually expects to fail. Its investments facilitated performance measure reveals its target to facilitate only half the investment achieved during Labor's last year in office. That's right, Mr Speaker. It's not just that they're expecting to fail, they've actually stopped trying. The outlook for Victoria's regions is sadly even worse. For all the Deputy Premier's bleatings, the government aims, that's right, it actually aspires to facilitate fewer jobs in regional Victoria than in each of the last 2 years. As the Deputy Premier loves to boast, Victorians have never seen anything like it. In our last budget, Mr Speaker, Victoria's population was growing at 2.2%, the highest rate since at least 1971. Now our population growth is slowing. In the 11 years that Labor was in office, an average of $581 million each year was invested in health-building projects. This government's own budget reveals that it will spend $100 million less over 4 years than we spent on average each and every year. While the Treasurer spruiks training as the key to productivity, this budget boasts the single largest cut to the TAFE sector in this state's history. The Victorian TAFE Association estimates that $100 million will be lost to the system every year because of the choice this government has made. And today Victorians are confronted with the astonishing revelation that the Minister for Higher Education, the Honourable Peter Hall, appears to have contemplated resignation as a consequence of these changes. But now he expects us to believe that he thinks that these changes will make Victoria's TAFE sector the strongest in the country.
How's that work?
That's right. That's right, Mr Speaker. He expects us to believe that he contemplated giving it away because he was making the system the strongest in the country. They must take Victorians for fools. Peter Hall is actually the canary in the mine. His first letter speaks for itself. He had the courage to call it, but not the courage to stand his ground. Mr Speaker, instead of telling Victorians that our state can be even better and delivering a budget that is a pathway to take us there, this government has driven expectations through the floor. They've cut and run. They've smashed our state's confidence. This budget is not an answer, it's an alibi. As Tim Colbatch observed yesterday in The Age, there was not, quote, anything resembling a jobs plan or anything aiming to get the economy to fire on all cylinders again. And there was nothing to answer the question Victorians are asking. Why does Ted Baillieu want to be Premier? Where does he want to take us? At some point, his government is going to have to tell us what it stands for. The budget was a missed chance to do that. Mr Speaker, many Victorians are asking the same questions. This budget contains no vision for our state, just a litany of excuses about why things can't be done. There are no plans for transport, for infrastructure, for health, for education or for jobs, just a narrative about tough times. Well, Labor faced tough times too. Our worst drought, our most tragic natural disaster on Black Saturday, and the global financial crisis, the worst economic downturn since the Depression. And these budget papers acknowledge that our GST write-downs during those times were as significant as the ones this government now claims prevent it from taking action to tackle some of our state's biggest challenges. No state government can control the economic cycle or fix the dollar, but a strong state government can invest in infrastructure to improve productivity and generate jobs. A strong state government can use its significant spending power to source locally rather than offshore. A strong state government can prioritise its spending to boost the construction industry. A strong state government can invest in skills and training. And, Mr Speaker, a strong state government can support Victorian companies seeking to become innovative and globally competitive. But this state government refuses to accept that it has a responsibility to do any of these things. The government's entire strategy is built on the premise that it is hostage to events rather than shaping them. Victorians are entitled to ask, what did Ted Baillieu think he was running for when he offered himself to lead our state in November 2010? Mr. Speaker, it's bad when politicians promise to fix problems they know they cannot fix. But it's even worse when politicians fail to fix the problems that they can. When Labor faced the global financial crisis, we recast the first homeowners bonus to support the building industry by targeting our assistance to new housing construction starts, particularly in regional Victoria. This and other actions that we took proved a great success. Victoria's property market defied expectations and stayed stronger than forecasters anticipated. This government has scrapped this bonus. This decision makes new houses less attractive than existing housing stock. Make no mistake about it, this decision will cost Victorian jobs.
That's right. No doubt.
Mr. Speaker, when Labor came to office, we established the Victorian Industry Participation Policy to ensure that where possible government spending supported local jobs. This policy was a direct result of the rolling stock replacement program undertaken by the former Kennett government in its last days in office, which saw hundreds of millions of dollars in new rolling stock destined to be sourced from overseas. Our policy gave Victorian companies seeking to supply goods and services to the Victorian government a fighting chance. From emergency service uniforms to new trains for our transport system, sending this work offshore is a surefire way to kill local jobs. But this government just doesn't seem to get it. In review after review, commissioned by the government's hand-picked experts recommend applying the blowtorch to Labor's Victorian Industry Participation Policy. Speaker, even in tough times, our government kept striving to maintain our state's leadership. Instead of raiding WorkCover's strong balance sheet to prop up the budget, as this government has done, our government used WorkSafe's strong capital position to establish WorkHealth, a world-first workplace preventative health check to identify the risk factors for chronic health conditions amongst Victorian workers. Mr. Speaker, we established the Victorian Cancer Action Plan. Two strategies to deal with the biggest health challenges facing Victorian people. This budget closes the door on Victoria's Cancer Action Plan. Mr. Speaker, the Treasurer continues to peddle two myths about Labor's economic record to justify the harsh measures that this government has taken. The first is the furphy that our state expenditures were on an unsustainable growth path. The Treasurer knows that this is not true. Once the federal stimulus funding is netted out, Victoria's revenue and expenditure growth pretty much paralleled each other over Labor's period in office. This can hardly be a revelation to the Treasurer. After all, it's the very reason every one of Labor's budgets over 11 years received an emphatic AAA credit rating from Moody's and Standard & Poor's. In the same breath, the Treasurer advances the spurious claim that Labor's budget was in structural deficit. If the Treasurer's logic, oxymoronic though that phrase may be, is accepted, then his own budget, dependent as it is on unsustainable cash grabs from public entities, his budget, his surplus, can be critiqued in precisely the same way.
Exactly right.
So, Mr. Speaker, every Victorian should know that the very foundations of the Treasurer's budget are based on spurious claims, justifying cruel cuts that will hurt Victorian families. Mr. Speaker, this budget's cruelest claim surely must be the Treasurer's boast in his budget speech that the government's spending priorities are focused on protecting the state's most vulnerable citizens.
Is that right?
Mr. Speaker, who are Victoria's most vulnerable citizens that the Treasurer has pledged to protect? Are they not the thousands of Victorians whose concessions, by the government's own admission, are set to fall in real terms? Think about it. CPI is forecast at 2.75%. Government wages policy is 2.5%. But our state government will only give the poorest Victorians 2%. If 2.5% is right for nurses, for teachers, for police, for public servants, for politicians, surely it's not right that the poorest Victorians are funded for only 2%.